right, welcome, folks. We are exactly at start time, and I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I am going to go ahead and get started. If people keep trickling in, it's of course no problem. And I just want to start with a reminder to let everyone know we will be sharing a recording of this afterwards. So if you can't stay for the whole time, or if you want to come back to anything within this, the recording will be available for you. And I'll also, when I send that out, I'll send the slides as well, a link to where those are, because I know sometimes you don't want to actually go back and watch the whole recording to get to something, but you might want to just go back to a slide. So you'll be able to access that either way. So welcome. I imagine that many of you know me because this is something that we just shared in our newsletter and Instagram. So you're probably familiar with What's Your Grief. But for anyone who isn't, in case this was shared with you indirectly in some way, my name is Lita Williams. I'm a clinical social worker, and I'm one of the two co-founders of What's Your Grief. What's Your Grief is a grief and bereavement support organization that has existed in the online space for a little over 10 years now. And we work really providing a lot of different creative and sort of outside the box psychoeducation and practical resources on coping with grief and loss. And we define grief and loss as both death and non-death losses. And we really started as an organization that was trying to meet the needs of people who were looking for something that was an alternative to counseling or support groups, or a supplement to counseling and support groups. Though Eleanor and I are both mental health professionals and clinicians ourselves, we, in our own personal losses that shaped so much of our lives, and certainly of What's Your Grief, we didn't always find the support that we needed in traditional counseling and support groups. We found it in a lot of other places. And so that is a big piece of what has driven what we do at What's Your Grief, has been listening to other people about what they need, what would be helpful, listening to clinicians and those in the grief space, sharing what might be a nice supplement to the work that they do. And so offering webinars like this is one small slice of the things that we offer. And we try to offer these webinars really as a response to what we're hearing from people who are in our community, who are on our newsletter list, or engaged in our social media, or on the website, or in our Griever member hub. When there are things that we feel like are being talked about a lot and there isn't a lot of support or resources for, that's one of the spaces we always try to create some resources and meet some of those needs. And unsurprisingly, recently in the world, there has been so much that we have, I think, all been consuming in so many different ways. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that that maybe have been coming up for you, that have made us all so aware of this intersection between our personal losses, which we're all navigating, collective and global losses and grief that we are all exposed to and seeing, and have varying levels of connection to, either very direct or maybe indirect, but certainly all are being impacted as the social beings that we are as humans, but also as people who are exposed to social media all the time, the 24-hour news cycle, and so many different things that impact our day-to-day life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and share these slides so it's a little bit bigger here for everybody. And I welcome anyone to please feel free. I know some of you are already saying hi in the chat. Please feel free to say hi in the chat. Also, please feel no obligation to say hi in the chat. You're welcome to just hang back and listen in this evening, but you're also welcome to contribute there, share. And if you have resources that have been helping you, things around this topic that have been useful, things that have been a struggle, please feel free to share those as well. We certainly have some thoughts and resources, but we know that there is so much out there, and we're always eager for people to be able to share what has been helping them so that it may be helpful to other people as well. I probably don't need to tell you why this is a topic that came up for so many people, has been coming up recently, and that we have heard requests for support around. We see so many things in our lives and what we're exposed to in the media and in social media that makes us so aware of all of the loss and pain and distress in the world, as well as things that contribute so deeply to our anxieties, right? We see things about climate issues that are happening, the opioid crisis, which many of you know is something that hits near and dear for us at What's Your Grief, with mental health, the mental health crisis in our country, where we see growing suicide rates, epidemics of loneliness that we hear about in the media all the time, racial violence, gun violence, wars, certainly everything that has been happening recently in Israel and Palestine, and all of the weight of the images that come with that. We're exposed to this all the time, and our brains certainly weren't designed to consume things in the way that social media and the 24-hour news cycle exposes us to now. This is such a real consideration when we get into talking about how we learn how to regulate and ground ourselves in times like this, is to consider that oftentimes what the world around us provides us with, these like little screens in our pockets where we can constantly get alerts and receive information, is not what our brains were used to consuming even 20 years ago. And this has a real effect on how we're able to regulate ourselves emotionally, how we're able to ground ourselves physically and emotionally. And it's a really important thing for us to be mindful of as we start to think about how we can regulate ourselves and feel grounded in a world that can feel so uncertain and so chaotic. Unsurprisingly, these feelings of grief, of despair, of anxiety that come up for us are incredibly normal. That doesn't mean that they're easy to cope with. But when we think about these things, it always reminds me of the Viktor Frankl quote, an abnormal response to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. Right? When we are constantly being exposed to so much pain in the world, to so much uncertainty, to so many things that we feel like we don't have control over, it's normal that our brains are in an anxiety overload at times. It's normal that if we spend too much time with the many things that we are exposed to, that we may feel ourselves in a despair where we feel helpless and hopeless and overwhelmed. It, as someone just shared in the chat, I appreciate you saying that, Linda, when we go through experiences like the pandemic, which have created changes in who we are, in our sense of safety and security and stability, in the way that we interact with other people in the world, it is normal that we are trying to learn how to regulate differently. We're trying to learn how to manage emotions in new and different ways than we had to navigate even just 10 or 20 years ago in terms of what we're exposed to. With so many things in the world, we don't know what's going to happen, right? We don't know if things are going to get better or get worse. We're not sure sometimes how we can best impact change, even around things that we are really passionate about. And we often don't have models on how to grieve some of these losses. When we think about our individual losses, we know how hard it is just to navigate the grief of those, right? We know how hard it is to make space for grieving the deaths of people who we loved so much, or estrangements from people who are in our lives, or other sort of significant personal losses. That's hard enough when society doesn't always make space for our grief, and when we're expected to sort of have a time limit to it, or to get over it, or move on from things, or when maybe there aren't necessarily rituals for the types of losses that we've experienced. But when we look at some of these more collective losses, some of these things that intersect with global experiences in the world, we have even fewer templates for what it looks like to have rituals around that, to grieve as a community, to make space for the emotional reactions that we're having in a way that allows us to feel like we're not being overwhelmed by those things, and that we're still able to function within the world. So I say that just to say, if you joined this evening because you have felt like it has been so hard to feel grounded and regulated in times that feel so overwhelming and chaotic, to say that's the place where so many of us are, and where we find ourselves. I think if we look at the research and the literature, I think where we find ourselves trying to consider what might help, what allows some people to be able to function a bit better within the midst of the enormity of so many different collective losses, while some people struggle even more, is thinking about what it means to tolerate uncertainty. And most of us as humans naturally do not tolerate uncertainty well, right? We as human beings, we like it when things are certain, even when what is certain is something really awful, or really daunting, or really terrible. When it's certain, we feel like we can make a plan. If you have ever been in that situation where you're waiting for test results on a biopsy, or something else that could have really, really serious and scary ramifications, that period of waiting, right, that uncertainty can create so much distress because of the unknowns, because it leaves our brain open to play out every possible situation. We're going back to it over and over and over and over again, and trying to consider what might happen. Whereas when we receive the information, even if that information is not what we wanted to hear, even if it is really difficult information, it gives our brain something to ground to, something to hold on to, that allows our brain to then go, okay, now we know what we're dealing with. Let's make a plan. That's where our brains are often very comfortable. Where our brains are not comfortable is in this place of the unknown, the uncertain, when it's unclear what the plan should be or how we should be functioning. So when we're in this place of uncertainty, for many of us, we don't tolerate it well, and we tend to react in ways that are sort of negative, in these really emotional, cognitive, and behavioral ways to these uncertain situations, because we are experiencing distress, because it's activated our nervous system in different ways, because we're trying to feel safer and more secure. So though this is a common for most of us, it's really, really difficult to build the skills around how to get better at tolerating uncertainty, to live in that middle space. But what we know is that people who do learn skills that help them to tolerate uncertainty, to be able to kind of exist in this both and space, this place where there's not a clear black and white, there's not clear knowns and unknowns in certain situations, those folks tend to be a little bit more protected from anxiety, or from depression, or post-traumatic stress, even following trauma. And those of us who experience higher intolerance of uncertainty, where we haven't learned the tools, where we haven't developed some of the skills, we're at greater risk for some of those things. So what part of what we want to do is talk a bit about intolerance, uncertainty, in terms of how this can manifest in ways you might see yourself in that aren't always the healthiest, and then how we can start to maybe shift into ways that give us a little bit more tolerance for that uncertainty. We're not going to get rid of the uncertainty. It's going to be there, right? All these things in the world are going to exist. So part of it is how we learn to manage ourselves differently. And I see, as some of you are sharing in the chat, there are so many other factors that come into play about our own personal histories that impact how well we're able to tolerate uncertainty, that impact our empathy and sensitivity, and how we might be activated by things that we experience in the world around us. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about how we can build more awareness of ourselves, taking into account our personal histories in ways that might help us to be able to navigate a little bit more seamlessly. So unsurprisingly, so there's all this uncertainty. And if we look at how the intolerance of uncertainty unfolds, is oftentimes when we are not able to tolerate it, we seek control. We try to figure out, okay, everything feels overwhelming. Everything feels out of control. How am I going to get control in this situation? And worrying is actually something that we do to try to feel more in control. We think, okay, if I can imagine every possible negative outcome, everything that could go wrong, every worst case scenario, that allows me to feel a little bit more certainty. Now, unfortunately, though our brain thinks that is going to help us to feel a little bit more of a sense of control or certainty, what it actually does is often increase our anxiety or our uncertainty. All of a sudden now we have played out so many anxiety provoking situations. We've allowed ourselves to get worried about a future that hasn't happened yet and that there is a good chance will not happen. Because part of what we do when we play out these worst case scenarios is we play out every single one. There's only going to be one future that's actually going to happen. But now we've managed to get ourselves worried about the 100 different possible futures that could happen rather than just that one that will come. And so this can be something that starts to really create a cycle for us. We also sometimes will make our lives and our world a little bit smaller to try to feel safe and comfortable. And we can see when the world is overwhelming and uncertain, and there's so many things that are happening in the world that we feel like we can't actively control, that one common response to that is, I am just going to stop reading the news. I'm going to stop looking at the information. I'm not going to pay attention to how many people died of substance-related deaths this year. I'm not going to look at information about climate change. I'm not going to pay attention to some of these things because I am trying to feel a little bit safer or more comfortable. And it can happen in our day-to-day lives of just being in the world in general with our grief. If I'm worried about my personal grief getting emotional in front of strangers, or I'm worried that I'm going to not be able to manage my emotions when I'm out doing holiday shopping, right? Maybe then I decide to try to make my world smaller and I just don't leave the house as often. And I just do my shopping online because I don't want to encounter any of those potential things in the world that might activate my grief or bring up my emotions. And so I do that trying to feel comfortable and safe. But often what happens is that my world is getting smaller. So I'm not encountering as many things that could have brought me positive emotion and good things. Yes, I may have gone out into the world and there may have been things that would have activated a little bit of my grief, but there may have also been a lot of really lovely, comforting things. There may have been beautiful holiday lights. There may have been people I would have seen, so I would have felt a little bit less isolated just by being around other people. But now I've cut myself off from that, and I get less practice with those situations and anxiety. I get less practice exposing myself to things that cause me a little bit of that pain and distress. And so now I feel less confident about whether I can manage it. I don't know how to regulate myself when those emotions come up if I never give myself practice to be able to do that. And so we end up feeling even less confident about those things. We also, as I talked about, right, we prepare for the every possibility, and then we end up feeling debilitated by all of those possible options that are out there. So it's unsurprising that when we look at the kind of turbulent times that we live in, the uncertainty that we're exposed to all the time in the media and in social media around us, that all of a sudden we often go to one extreme or the other. Because of how distressing it is to be exposed to all of these things in the world, we might just stick our heads in the sand, right? We use the ostrich approach and we're just like, okay, it's in capable hands. There are people out there who are looking at the opioid epidemic and trying to solve the problem. There are people who are out there navigating, all of the work trying to be negotiated in Israel and Palestine or around climate issues. And we just think it's someone else's job. I can't affect change. I'm one person. It's too big. It's too much. If I allow myself to feel it, I'm not going to be able to stop feeling it. I'm not going to be able to manage my feelings around it. So I just need to put it over here, right? Or we may be on the other end of the spectrum where we become completely consumed, right? Where we are entrenched in it. This, I think a lot of people can relate to this when the uncertainty at the beginning of the pandemic happened, where at the beginning of the pandemic, people became consumed with everything in the news, right? People were trying to read constantly, figure out what to do, trying to find something to hold on to give them a sense of certainty. But without anything there, it's just a bottomless rabbit hole, right? They just kept going and going and going. And then in doing that, people will often find that they become so consumed and overwhelmed that they feel like there's no space for their personal loss anymore. They're so consumed by the suffering in so many places in the world for so many reasons that we'll minimize our own grief and think to ourselves, how can I be so upset about my one single personal loss when there are so many people in the world facing loss upon loss upon loss? Or how can I go out and enjoy my Thanksgiving with family, or just a nice evening walk when so many people in the world are suffering? And so we become so overwhelmed and kind of consumed by that guilt that we don't create space for our own experiences of our personal grief or our own experiences of connection or joy, any of those things in the world. We feel like it is all or nothing. And I see a couple of people sharing in the chat something that I feel like is very true, right? Is that when we're overwhelmed by our personal grief, that we feel like, if I'm barely managing my own personal loss, how can I possibly create space for awareness of all of these other things that are in the world? And I want to give you permission right now to say, we always have to protect ourselves first, right? We have to figure out how to live with and carry our own personal grief in order to be able to engage in the world in ways that are collectively meaningful and supportive, right? If we're still in a place where our personal grief is so raw and we're still learning to navigate that we could really be pushed over the edge and undone by some of these other collective things in the world, sometimes we do need to be even more protective of how we navigate this. But where I would encourage people to be mindful is that sometimes what we think is that means that we have to do it forever. So early in grief, for example, maybe I try to re-engage in the world in maybe a way that's really benign, right? I try to go back to my book club for the first time, or maybe in a way that's more actively engaged with something significant. Maybe I decide to do something around a cause that I'm passionate about, but that does carry a lot of emotional weight or grief with it. In either of those situations, if I go out and it's too much or it's too overwhelming, it would be very easy for me to go back home and say, oh my gosh, I can never do that again, right? This loss means that I will never be able to be in that situation ever again. And it's important that we go back and that we revisit some of these things with time, and that we learn that we are, with time, learning to carry our grief differently. We're learning to be more aware of what activates us. We're learning to be more aware of when we're activated and overwhelmed by our grief, of what we can do to take care of ourselves. We're able to figure out what are the things that help us to be able to engage with our memories of the people who've died differently, so that we can kind of bring them into the world with us in ways that don't feel like they're going to overwhelm us. So that is something that slowly, and I know it is a long road, right? But it is something that slowly happens with time. And it can be important for us to remember that, so that we can revisit certain things that maybe early on felt like they were too much, to be able to know that doesn't mean that they'll be too much forever. So with this, thinking about both of these things, we then have to ask this question, like, well, what do we do instead? How, if we're feeling so overwhelmed, or so shut down that we've just stuck our heads in it completely, in the sand completely, or if you find yourself completely consumed down that rabbit hole where you can't stop, with things that are defining all of your time and all of your day, and making it hard to function, it then it sort of begs this question: how do we find balance? What are the things that we do? How do we ground ourselves? And there isn't one answer to this. We're going to talk about a number of different ideas and strategies that come from different places. But this is one that I want to introduce, that comes from the goodgriefnetwork.org. And I encountered this when I read the book Generation Dread by Britt Ray. W-R-A-Y is her last name. And she is someone who has worked in the climate space for a long time, and who is experiencing a lot of personal anxiety and loss and distress and dread around the work that she was doing around the climate crisis. And she was really struggling emotionally to manage that, alongside a lot of other things in her life and personal challenges that she was facing. And in her book, which is an outstanding book, she talks about her path to ways of managing that anxiety. And one of them was that she started attending support groups put together by this organization, bringing together people who were coping with those same things that she was. And one of the founders of this organization, the Good Grief Network, when they came together to start these support groups, they modeled them off of the Nar-Anon-Al-Anon model. So for any of you, if you're familiar with Nar-Anon and Al-Anon, these are the support groups that exist for people who are family members and friends of those who have an addiction. So for those who may have an alcohol use disorder or other substance use disorder. And when I learned that, I thought this was really interesting, right? So when we see the 10 steps here, these 10 steps were inspired by the steps of Nar-Anon, which are inspired by the steps of AA-NA. And it really resonated with me and made sense to me why someone who was involved in Nar-Anon may have seen connections to grounding and looking for actions that could be helpful with this uncertainty in the world, based on what Nar-Anon does. Because for anyone who has loved someone with a substance use disorder, you probably well know something that I well know, which is that it is such a challenge to figure out what it means to love someone and want to care and support and have a relationship with a person with a substance use disorder, while also not becoming overwhelmed and consumed, and while protecting ourselves in ways that we stay grounded to who we are, and that we're able to look at our actions and be able to say, is this truly value connected to me, right? Am I truly making decisions in ways that feel like they're the decisions that I'm want to be making, that are the safe decisions for me and the safe decisions for the person who I love and care about? And in so many ways, I could see why this connected to not just climate issues, but so many things in the world that feel outside of our control. So many issues related to injustices that we see in the world, the things that are connected to violence and pain, and so many things that are outside of our control, that we often feel deep connection to these things. We feel like they're important. We want to be able to engage with them and feel like we're acting as citizens of the world and as people who care about each other and our communities and our country and globally. And yet we are often trying to navigate how to do that while protecting ourselves, while taking care of our own grief, while being able to be thoughtful about what is actually helpful and what's not actually helpful. When are we doing things just because we're reactive and we're overwhelmed? I imagine many people relate to going, wow, I lost hours of my time on social media, going down a rabbit hole of reading articles or arguing with somebody in a comment section, or things like this, that afterwards felt like this wasn't me acting from a place that was connected to my values and protecting myself. It was me being reactive because I was overwhelmed or because something activated me in the world around me. And it felt value connected in the moment. But when I look back on it, I didn't feel good about it. I didn't feel good about how I handled it. Or, where we felt like because of our own grief, of our own loss, or of where we were mentally and emotionally, we didn't even try to engage with these things that felt important to us in the world because we felt like we didn't know how to do it and stay balanced and stay grounded. So being able to kind of look at this balance. So these are the steps that she put together. And you can see them here. Like I said, I'll share these so you can come back to this, right? But accept the severity of the predicament. Be with uncertainty, right? This idea of tolerating uncertainty. Honor my mortality and the mortality of all. Do inner work, which might mean different things for all of us, but I think speaks to something that we're well, many have commented on in the chat, right? Sometimes we're still working on a lot of our inner stuff related to personal losses and other things that we need to do to achieve balance. Develop awareness of biases and perception. Practice gratitude, witness beauty, create connections. Take breaks and rest, right? Being able to recognize that in order for us to function in the world in the ways that we feel like we can be a good friend, a good neighbor, a good employee, that we can be connected in those ways, that we need to be taking breaks and resting in so many ways, especially when we feel overwhelmed by all that is happening in the world. Grieve harms that we have caused that may be coming up. Show up, right? It's easy for us to sometimes be in that shutdown place. And that might mean figuring out what it means to show up in a way that's healthy for you, in a way that's contained and boundaried and protected. And knowing that the way that you show up right now, maybe when you're navigating a lot of your personal grief or an early loss, or are feeling deeply connected to certain painful things that are going on, it might look really different than how you were able to show up for things 5 years ago, or how you'll be able to show up for things 5 years from now. And that's okay. We can give ourselves permission to show up differently, to show up in ways that maybe feel a little bit more, balanced or smaller, and reinvest in meaningful efforts. And this piece, I think, is really important, right? To think about what meaningful efforts are. What are the ways that sometimes, because of that intolerance of uncertainty and us grasping for ways to feel grounded, do we sometimes put in efforts that drain us? They deplete us from things because we get consumed. We're reading all the articles, we're looking at all the things on social media, but they're not necessarily the things that actually feel meaningful and focused. And I appreciate, Jennifer, what you just shared of, engaging in global losses maybe is donating to causes that felt important in memory of people who you've lost. And sometimes it's looking for what are meaningful ways for each of us individually, and they may look very different for all of us, of what feels like meaningful engagement versus what are things that end up feeling like they have depleted us without feeling meaningful in the way that we wanted or needed them to be. So part of the process of, looking at these is, I think we can see some things that might come really intuitively, and help us to think of how we do this. But I want to think a little more practically about how we might achieve some of these things, and consider that they relate to so much uncertainty in the world, wherever that might be coming up for you, or the overwhelm comes up for you. And as we do this, if you have come to any of our workshops before, you have probably heard us talk about dialectical thinking. I don't think there's ever a time that we don't talk about it. And it is, I think, one of the foundations that's so important as we continue to go from here to think about what might help us and ground us, is to be able to say that part of this is being able to tolerate feeling multiple things at the same time. Sometimes things that feel very much in conflict with one another, but being able to recognize that so much of the world we live in is about feeling so many different emotions at the same time, and learning how to do that when often we haven't been taught that. We've been taught, you're either happy or you're sad. You're either calm or you're anxious. We haven't often learned how to sit with these different feelings, even though we know that they often do come up at the same time, and we're learning to manage them. And also that sometimes we can really benefit and grow from them. One of the things that we may look at here, right, honoring our mortality and the mortality of all, it makes me think about the ways that sometimes the things that cause us the deepest anxieties are also the things that make us so grateful for the things that we do have and encounter, right? The things in the world that we're so appreciative for. Sometimes it is with grief that we become so much more aware of how limited time is. And that can create so much anxiety, right? We may be so worried about us getting some sort of illness, our own possible death, the deaths of other people, of family members, who are in recovery, of them starting to use again, and the risks of overdose. All of those things become so real for us when we have experienced loss directly and closely. And on the other side of that, often those may be the very things that leave us saying that we value and appreciate time that we have here on this earth more than ever. Time in nature, time connecting to other people, being able to value that. So part of this process is, how do we ground in these places where we see, yes, sometimes this uncertainty is here, and how do we find the other things in it? So I'm going to draw on some tools here to talk about some tools that come from acceptance and commitment therapy, in part because I think acceptance and commitment therapy really is aligned with why, with this uncertainty and overwhelm and turbulent times in the world, because it is grounded in the idea that what they're trying to offer, what they're trying to provide in acceptance and commitment therapy are tools and ways to help human beings live rich and meaningful lives, handling all the pain that is part of that life. So their premise is that life is difficult, right? It's not that it's that we should be striving for this ideal all the time of life being happy or joyful, that a full human life, a full, rich, authentic human life comes with the full range of human emotions. And that means that we need to learn how to both feel the range of those emotions without feeling debilitated by those emotions, and to figure out what it means to feel them while still having a rich and meaningful life. And that a normal human mind, frustrating as this is, naturally amplifies psychological suffering. It draws us to anxiety, to uncertainty. We have negativity bias in our minds. We are much more likely to notice the threats in the world around us, the things that scare us, the things that we feel uncertain about, than we are the things that feel calm and soothing and comfortable and wonderful, because our brains are trying to protect us, right? Like if there's a tiger in the bushes waiting to attack us, our brains have developed to try to find that threat, to hear that rustle and think that it might be something that's going to hurt us. If it's just a squirrel, well, great, we're lucky, right? But our brains would rather overcorrect. Our brains would rather protect us from the worst. And so we're often in a place of this negativity bias that comes from self-protection, which means that we have to do extra work and use extra tools to see how this is happening and how we can counter it a little bit. And so the idea here is to develop what the acceptance and commitment folks call psychological flexibility, the ability to contact the present moment fully and consciously, guided by our values, even when we are overwhelmed and distressed, and when there is so much pain and suffering that we're experiencing. And this is hard, right? Because they say that oftentimes when we feel that pain, we feel that distress, it causes us to act in reactive ways. It causes us not to thoughtfully respond, but instead to just react in ways that then we look back on and we realize weren't necessarily helpful for us, or weren't necessarily the things that felt good for us. And this isn't something that we do overnight, but this is something that slowly we can build as we do some work clarifying what's really important to us. Where are our values? How do we connect with the things that are going to guide and motivate us, while learning skills that help us to handle pain, to sit with uncertainty, to engage in the world, even with those things that feel so painful, to take committed actions that are connected to our values, and to savor the fulfilling things in life, even when they are happening alongside of some of the most painful things in life, and to realize that sometimes those two things are deeply connected. So this always, I always just want to remind people that the goal with this, that they're so, that they really focus on, is that it's not always going to be reducing distress in the way that we wish we could. With so many of these things that are happening in the world, the only way that we could really maybe get rid of the distress truly is to imagine that thing going away, right? So like everything to magically be cured. And in so many of these situations, we aren't going to necessarily be able to fix them. They're not just going to go away, even if they improve, even if they get better. There are so many of these crises in the world around us that are going to continue to exist. Our family members who we miss, who we love, who have died, that's not going to change. That for the rest of our lives, they're still going to be dead, right? And part of grief is learning how to live with that, and knowing there's always going to be a pain and distress that comes with that. It's never going to magically go away. And we can learn to live in the world differently with that. They describe this sometimes as the word vitality, which I feel like is a weird word. I don't necessarily resonate with it, but the way they define it is being fully alive in the here and now, no matter how we feel. That is something that we can feel like we're working towards, and working towards this idea that that we can learn to do that differently. So they describe this as a choice point, right? That we, in any given moment, when we're feeling so many feelings inside of us, a million directions that maybe have been activated by so many turbulent and uncertain things in the world around us, that the goal in this choice point is that we can ground ourselves so that how we live in the world moves us towards the person we want to be, the values that we have, the things that feel important to us, and that we can avoid maybe getting pulled away by the things that our brain and our body and our negativity bias and our reactive autonomic nervous system, the way they may be pulling us in other different directions. So some of you may another Viktor Frankl quote that we often share that I really appreciate is this bottom one here. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And so some of these tools are about that, about thinking about how we can be a little bit more flexible so that we can hopefully move more towards our values, even when things feel chaotic and uncertain, and that we can tolerate a little of that uncertainty. So the first kind of process that they talk about is building our acceptance. And I'm always so cautious with the word acceptance because I feel like, unfortunately, in the grief world, it is associated with the 5 stages, which, we certainly do not think that we grieve in 5 stages, or that acceptance looks the way that many people assumed that was implied by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, even though I don't think that's ever exactly what she meant. What they mean by acceptance is, how do we build the ability to sit with whatever the feelings are of that uncertainty, of that distress, of what we're feeling in the world? How do we accept them and still feel like we can engage in the world, we can be present, we can still do things that are important to us? This is hard, right? Because our natural response is oftentimes when there's something that's a threat, that's scary, that's overwhelming. Certainly when we have lost someone we love, there is no greater threat to our safety and security than losing somebody who meant the world to us. It activates our autonomic nervous system. We go into fight, flight, or freeze. All of a sudden, we are acting from this place where we have stress hormones that are impacting what we do and the decisions that we make. And so the first thing that we can start to do is get to know our body, get to listen more to our autonomic nervous system, to start to sense it when some of this activation is coming up, and maybe we're starting to get pulled down a path that isn't healthy for us, or that isn't helpful for us, or we're going to make decisions that don't feel rooted in our values. So we can notice these things and learn what activates us, what calms us down, what helps us to feel more connected when we feel overwhelmed, when we've had something in the world that has caused us to feel like we need to shut down, or we're melting in a pool of tears and we feel like we're never going to be able to get it under control. What are the things that help us to calm ourselves in that moment? How do we start to learn that? And how do we learn that even when we feel overwhelmed, even when stuff comes up for us, that we can sometimes still engage in the world? We can come back into our body. We can re-engage in the things that we are doing in new, conscious, and deliberate ways. So in ACT, they call this dropping anchor. And it's a technique for dealing with difficult emotions when they come up, where we just acknowledge exactly what's coming up for us, what we're feeling, how it feels in our body, where it is, tuning into it rather than trying to get rid of it, shut it down, ignore it, push it away. Instead, we do the opposite, right? We lean into it. We accept the feelings that are coming up. and we become really tuned into them. We listen to them and figure out where they are, how they feel in our body, and then we try to re-engage in what we were doing. We don't assume that just because we have felt this distress, that we've been overwhelmed for a moment, that means that we have to disengage. We look to see, can we re-engage in a way that feels safe? So, they call this ACE, is just a nice little reminder of how to do this, to acknowledge the thoughts and feelings, label them, observe them, try to separate ourselves, which we'll talk a little more about, and then come into our bodies, right? To do this, I'll read quickly from a little meditation that they use around this. Take a moment to acknowledge that there are difficult thoughts and feelings that are showing up for you right now. At the same time, see if you can push your feet hard into the floor. Push your feet down. Feel the ground beneath you. Now sit forward in your chair and straighten your back. Feel the chair beneath you and notice your back supporting you. Press your fingertips together, and as you do that, move your elbows and your shoulders. Feel your body and where there may be pain or tension in your body. Feel your arms moving all the way from your fingers to your shoulder blades. Take a moment to acknowledge that there is a lot of pain here and that you're struggling with it. You didn't ask for this pain. You didn't ask for this overwhelm, but here it is. And it's challenging and it's difficult and you want it to go away, but it's not going. It's staying here with you. Silently acknowledge to yourself what type of pain it is. Say to yourself, here is sadness. Here is anxiety. Here is that painful memory that has come up. Notice that there are painful thoughts and feelings here, but there is also a body around all of this pain. It's holding it and containing it. And it's a body that you can move and you can control. You can still straighten your back. You can notice your whole body now. You can notice and feel and move your hands and your feet and your arms and your legs. Gently move them. Have a good stretch. Notice your muscles. Press your feet down and feel the floor. Look around the room, up, down, side to side. Notice 5 things that you can see. Notice 3 or 4 things you can hear. Sounds coming from me or from the room around you. Notice you and me together here. Notice that there are some difficult thoughts and feelings and that you're struggling with them, but at the same time, you can still notice your body in the chair. You can still take control of your arms and legs. You can still be present in this room around you and notice the things that you see in this room, the things that you hear, the things that you appreciate in this room. Notice if you feel any differently now. Not that your pain has necessarily gone away or that the thoughts and the feelings have disappeared, but do you feel a little less hooked by them, a little less swept away or overwhelmed or jerked around by them? Is it any easier for you to re-engage in the world, to re-engage in the here and now, to focus on the actions that you want to take next? So again, you may not always, though you can look up meditations on this. And when I send out the replay, I'll send links to a couple of dropping anchor meditations. You don't need a meditation to do it, right? It's this ACE idea of how do you acknowledge what's coming up, to really be able to come into your body and then to engage in what you're doing, to engage back in the world, even though those feelings are still there, as we try to find a way to sort of change our relationship with these things. We're not trying to control the waves or the weather, right? We're not trying to make it all go away. We're trying to figure out how do we learn how to feel it in a new way and engage with it in a new way, so that hopefully with time, that overwhelm may start to shift. But even if it doesn't, do we learn how to engage in the world differently? And part of this that is a tool that they call diffusion. I mentioned that in there, and in what I read was the idea of separating ourselves from some of the thoughts and emotions that come up. We are often overwhelmed by these negative thoughts, by everything in the world. It feels hopeless. It feels overwhelming. It feels like I can't control anything. It feels like my grief is too much for me to handle. We have all these negative thoughts that come up. And if you're familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, you might know that sometimes there's this approach to trying to change our thoughts. But many times, we can't change our thoughts. It is really difficult. Many times our thoughts, they're not inaccurate, they're not wrong, right? They're real. Or the person we love is gone. They're still gone. We're not going to change that thought, right? That's still there, that's real. But we are able to then think about how much we get hooked to it, how much it controls what we do in the world. It can be really hard to change our thoughts, but it can sometimes be more helpful if we're able to instead observe our thoughts, to separate ourselves from them, to observe what's coming up for us, and then decide what we're going to do with them differently. So we call this diffusion and ACT, that we try to get a little less fused to those thoughts and those feelings, that anxiety or that uncertainty that feels so overwhelming. How do we learn to see it and maybe name it when it comes up? The ACT has all sorts of different tools to be able to do this. I think the most simple one is the one that I read in that meditation. Being able to say, oh, wait, here is sadness, here is anxiety, right? Instead of I'm anxious or I'm angry, of being able to say, maybe I notice my anxiety, right? I'm observing it from afar a little bit. I'm having the thought that this is never going to get any better. I'm having the thought that I don't have any control in this moment. When I say I'm having the thought that, I distance myself from the thought a little bit. I observe it. One thing they talk about in ACT is once I'm observing it, then I can interrogate it a little bit. I might go do I buy it? I'm having the thought that I have no control, but do I buy that? There probably is something I can control in this moment, even though it feels like everything is out of control. Sometimes they say to, sing our thoughts or to write them in all sorts of silly fonts or letters, or draw them, where we can start to separate ourselves from them. We can also do what we call naming the story. If there's certain things that come up for you all the time, and maybe you realize this is your catastrophizing story. When I say to myself, oh, I'm never going to be able to concentrate at work again, right? I'm using that always never language. I'm catastrophizing. And maybe you start to see that's a pattern for you. So you go, oh, there's me doing that catastrophizing story again, right? Because I'm able to call it a story. I'm able to label it and say, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. But I'm able to get a little bit of distance that allows me to then maybe not be controlled by that thought quite as much, right? If I think to myself, I'm just one person, there's so many things going on in the world that I can't control. And I might shut down. I take no action at all. I do nothing. I feel like it's too much. But if I'm able to take a step back and I'm able to say, oh, wow, there is that helpless story again, right? There is me feeling overwhelmed again. I'm able to contextualize myself where I am almost an outside observer. I see myself as a little bit different than just all those thoughts and emotions that are cycling up in me, that certainly might be activated by stuff I see on social media, or when I walk outside and I see something in the world around me that activates my fear or my anxiety. I'm able to say, oh, there's my fear and anxiety. But I'm separate from it. And I want to be able to observe it, learn from it, and decide what I'm going to do differently. So sometimes one way to describe this is thinking of ourselves as the sky, right? And all of the things that we feel as the weather. So our noticing self, that self that can observe the uncertainty, the anxiety, the overwhelm, the grief, the pain, the distress. It is the sky behind all of the bad weather. So there's another passage I'll read around this, right? You're noticing self is like the sky. Thoughts and feelings are like the weather. The weather changes continually, but no matter how bad it gets, it doesn't harm the sky. The mightiest thunderstorm, the most turbulent hurricane, the most severe winter blizzard, these things don't hurt the sky. They don't change the sky. No matter how bad the weather, the sky always has room for it. And sooner or later, the weather always changes. Now, sometimes we forget that the sky is there. It's blocked by clouds, it's blocked by rain and storms, but it's still there. Sometimes we can't see the sky, but if we rise high enough above those clouds, even the thickest, darkest thunder clouds, sooner or later we reach clear sky, stretching in all directions, boundless and pure. More and more, you can learn to access this part of you, a safe space inside from which to open up and make room for the difficult thoughts and feelings, but from a safe viewpoint from which you can step back and observe them, knowing that they can't harm you. Another way that I like to think about this that is maybe not as beautiful of a metaphor as they use with the sky is like the film Inside Out, if anybody has ever seen the Pixar film, right? Where we see this character, the main character, Joy, and inside with the main character in the film, and then we see joy and anger and disgust and fear, sadness as these little kind of people inside inside of her head, right? And they all are in there. They all have their own voice. They all bring different things at different times. But ultimately, she is able to be driving the bus, right? No one of them is able to kind of always take control, although we see a lot of different. It's a great film if you haven't seen it yet. But we're able to kind of pull back and learn things differently. And this can create a wisdom from our emotions. As I talked about in the beginning, it is normal for us when there is so much uncertainty, when there's the pain of loss, when we don't know what the future is going to look like. It is normal that we are going to be feeling so many feelings. And when we can diffuse from them, then we can often start to ask ourselves questions about what are these emotions teaching us? Why are they coming up, right? What does this emotion, what's it reminding us to do in terms of taking care of ourselves or someone else? If this emotion could give you words of advice, what would it say? If you could follow its advice, would you be moving towards, like we talked about earlier, towards your values, towards who you want to be in the world? Or if you followed this emotion's advice, would it be moving you away, right? There are many moments, I think, when this comes up with anger, right? Where we realize, wow, anger can feel like such an empowering emotion. It can be the thing that gets us out of bed in the morning sometimes. And yet sometimes we realize that if we took its advice, when we take its advice, when we act on it because we're so activated in our fight or flight response, it actually is pulling us away from where we want to be. What does this emotion signal to others? What does the emotion tell you that you care about, that you need more of, that you need less of, that you need differently? What does this emotion help you do? What is this emotion preventing you from doing? And that's not to look at these emotions from a place of judgment, right? It's not about saying, oh, it's preventing me from doing a thing I want to do, and so I should hate this emotion or try to stop feeling this emotion. We're not trying to stop feeling these emotions. We're trying to accept that they're here, to notice them differently, and to decide that we can still engage in the world sometimes in ways that are moving towards, that are doing something that's not what that emotion is necessarily telling us to do. But we've learned how to unhook ourselves in a new way so that we can still engage in the world in a way that feels connected to our values. And this is the last piece of things. I know that I have gone over. I didn't set an end time to this webinar, but I know a lot of times people have an hour in their heads. I'm gone a few minutes over already, but we're wrapping up into the last piece of things. So if you do have to hop off, please feel feel free to come back and finish up when the recording is sent out. The last piece of thinking about ACT and committed action and how we can engage in the world is really grounding in our values. And knowing that sometimes when we're overwhelmed by one particular thing that's happening in the world, whether that be what has been going on with Israel and Palestine, or whether it has been an election that's going on, or something else that has pulled us, and it's what we're seeing everywhere and being stimulated by, sometimes we're just thinking about what are our values connected to that thing because we're feeling so overwhelmed by that thing. Sometimes it's that our grief is overwhelming us, and so it's so hard for us to see our values at all because grief makes us feel disconnected sometimes from our values, or we've lost sight of what some of our values were, or they've changed in our loss. And so part of this process of grounding, when there is so much uncertainty, when there is so much that's turbulent and painful in the world, is us coming back and regrounding to our own values, of asking ourselves the question about what directions do we want to move in our lives in all different domains. So our values, they are sort of this compass that underpins so much of what we do in the world, right? If I think about friendship is important to me, and what values do I are part of me being a good friend or feeling important in my friendship. Maybe it is loyalty. Maybe it's humor. It's somebody who I can laugh with. Maybe it is it's actual connection. It is being able to reach out to someone or have them reach out to me. Maybe it is shared history together, right? But thinking about what are our values in different areas? What are our values at work? What are our values in our community? What are our values around our spirituality? What are our values in our physical health and well-being, right? What are the values that feel important to us? And that one of the crucial things in our committed action, when we are feeling grounded and like we're moving towards that person who we want to be, that we know puts us in a place of grounding and well-being, it's saying we don't want any one thing to dominate. We don't want any one value to throw things out of balance or out of different areas. If we become so consumed sometimes in one area, or if we are so consumed by grief, we can realize that we're out, our balance is really off, and we've really are struggling to regain that. And it's, again, it's normal. It's okay. Of course, when there are things that are happening in the world, they pull our attention. Of course, when we're grieving, we need the time and space to be able to reorient ourselves to our values, to reconnect with our values, to figure out how we're going to restore balance again and what our values are going to look like as we go forward. But part of it is that we're doing that work of trying to reground ourselves, of asking ourselves the questions about our values and how those will guide our actions, so that we can move forward in a way that feels conscious and grounded, even when there's so much chaos around us. We may often really see that our values are a connection to the person who has died. We may see that the values that we know most strongly still exist in us are the values that they taught us, or that were part of our shared life together, or that were important to them, and that we want to live on in the world after our loss, even though they're not here anymore. Sometimes because we feel like when we live out those values, we're extending their legacy. We are, continuing to have their impact ripple in the world because we are staying connected to those values. And so, we have to remind ourselves sometimes that our values are not our feelings. Sometimes our feelings pull us in totally different directions from our values. I might value friendship, and within friendship, I value connection. And yet, man, in my grief, I might not feel like seeing any of my friends or responding to text messages or reaching out to anyone. I may, in many cases, realize that the way my feelings are coming up for me, they're not always tied to my values. And that's okay, right? But it can allow us to think differently about our thoughts and our feelings when they come up, and be able to say, all right, sometimes the world pulls me in so many different directions. I get activated in so many ways by uncertainty, by grief, by pain. And I can try to reground in myself, in my body, try to reconnect with my values, and then try to look at the ways that I take committed action that is connected to my values. And this might be really small, right? This might be saying, I cannot pay attention to anything that is going on in the world right now. It's too much. It's too overwhelming with my own grief. I can't do that. But I am today going to go out and do something that connects to my value of creativity and spontaneity, right? Maybe that was something that was always important to my loved one, that's something that I want to put in the world today, that I want to do for myself today. Maybe it is something connected to, we just passed Thanksgiving, right? Gratitude or generosity. I decide in some small way, I maybe can't take on all these huge, overwhelming problems, but I can do something today that connects me to those values. I can be more the type of friend or type of citizen or type of neighbor that I want to be. I can maybe do it better than I did it yesterday. And that's something that I have control over and I have some certainty with. And we can look for that balance, and we can ask ourselves questions to clarify our values. What were values that were important to you before the loss? If you have felt so disconnected from values, if you have felt like you just haven't been able to do anything that feels value connected, asking yourself what that was, or what are values that were connected to the person that you lost that you want to see continue in the world, in yourself, that you want to carry forward as part of their legacy or a co-destiny that you can have with them. What is one big thing that you hope to accomplish, right? That feels important to you, whether that is this month, this year, this decade, or just in the rest of your lifetime. What would you want to be remembered for? That can help us to think about our values. How do you want other people to see and experience you in the world? And how does that connect with the values that are important to you? All of these things can kind of come together and be part of our committed, grounded action. So that when there's so much that feels outside of our control, when there is so many emotions of grief that are overwhelming us, that are sometimes pulling us 8,000 different directions and leading us to have days where, at the end of the day, we just don't always feel connected to our values. We can slowly start to regain this, right? It's not going to be overnight. This is not about it looking perfect, where everything we do every day is a value committed action, but it's about that sort of progress, not perfection, of being able to say, how do we slowly start to reconnect? How do we slowly start to learn to regulate our body a little bit more, to notice when our nervous system is activated, to be able to say, wait, is all this social media helping me or harming me? When I spend all of this time in a place with people that really create stress for me, what does that do to the way that I make decisions in the world or how I act in the world? And how can I start to maybe change things in small ways that allow me to feel a little more connected to my values and a little more confident that I'm moving towards, right? That I'm doing that kind of way of moving a little bit closer, slowly but surely, towards the person who I want to be in the world after my loss, knowing that it will be a long road and we'll never hit perfection, but we can slowly move towards that. So I we'll leave you there with that, just this idea of trying to connect with some of these things, of that acceptance, being present in our body, diffusing, opening up, being present, doing what matters, even when that distress is there with us. And I will send out, like I said, the recording of this. I will send out the slides if you want to revisit anything. If you have suggestions of things that have helped you to feel a little bit more grounded in uncertain times, that have helped you to feel a little bit more calm in such an uncertain and turbulent world, please feel free to share it in the chat before we say goodbye, as it might help other people. You can keep in touch with us on social at What's Your Grief. Our newsletter, you can sign up for at what'syourgrief.com. It's a free newsletter. And our Griever Hub, where we do a lot of things like this, webinars, and we have a forum and book club and community and writing, and where you can just hang out with us, is we open membership 4 times a year. It's open for 2 more days. That's in our communities tab on What's Your Grief, if you have any interest in that. But thank you all so much for joining this evening. I know I went a little longer than I'd hoped, but I do hope that it was helpful, or at least there were a couple takeaways. And thanks for the kind words in the chat, folks. I'll keep an eye out for a minute in case there's any questions or anything else that comes up, any other suggestions. But otherwise, I hope everyone has a really good evening. Oh, and thanks, Mary, for sharing the Griever information, hub information in the chat.